Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we talk about the changing nature of work. I'm Susie Jackson. I am a news editor at LinkedIn, coming to you live from my home in New York City. Today on the show, we are going to talk about the notion of the post pandemic city. Cities, especially right now, are being hit hard with overlapping crises. We are seeing massive numbers of COVID-19 cases, bringing urban health systems to the brink, and the ensuing economic fallout of lockdowns leading to hits on the culture, social fabric, and vibrancy that cities are known for. And now, of course, cities are the main stage for sustained mass protests in response to the police killings of unarmed Black citizens. As cities begin to reopen, we want to talk about the opportunities to do so more thoughtfully, intentionally, and equitably. And as we do on the show today, I want to hear from you. Drop your comments and questions in the stream. Are you a city dweller? Did you decide to stay during COVID? Did you leave? What has that decision been like for you? What has that made your life look like and your thought of cities as this has progressed? Are you not in a city? Do you live elsewhere? And what is your notion of cities? How is it changing during this time? I feel like this is a crossroads where anything cities have been before, now is a chance for them to perhaps become something different. And we want to talk about that on the show today. We are going to have a panel of amazing experts coming out. Actually, I want to join them, invite them to join us right now. A lot of great people joining us. We have Johnny Little. He's the owner of E-Little Communications Group and was the former PR consultant for the city of Ferguson as it responded to the police killing of Michael Brown. Andre Perry is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and the owner of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Richard Florida is a professor at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management, the founder of City Lab. And Rebecca Karp is the CEO of the urban strategy consultancy Karp Strategies. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susie.
This is a huge topic. We are going to cover
Thanks for having us.
a short amount of time. We're going to try to cover some broad issues and jump around a little bit. I'm so glad that you all are here with us today. And Richard, I want to get started with you. Cities have been hotbeds for coronavirus. They are dense. They can be horribly inequitable. They've been the stage for these large protests. Reports are that people are fleeing cities. Should we believe the headlines? Are cities over?
No. No crisis or pandemic has killed cities, and we've dealt with far worse. The Spanish flu of 1918, cholera epidemics, and we didn't have advanced medical technology or the ability to use antivirals or develop a vaccine. So no, I mean, every time this happens, we get the usual run of dystopian takes. It just happens every time there's a crisis, whether that was the terrorist attacks of 9/11 or the financial and economic crisis of 2008. And in those cases, cities came back stronger. I'm not sure that'll be the case this time, but no, cities are not over. I think cities will become younger. I think that families, especially families with children, may exit cities, and we've seen a little bit of that. And by the way, depending on what estimate you like, anywhere between 5% of people left New York, but more like, if you look at mail forwarding, about 1.6% of people left New York. That's not a huge amount of people. And maybe if we use this crisis and coupled with the tremendous outpouring of civil disobedience that we've seen, some people call it unrest, but an incredible surge of multi-class, multiracial protest about the inequities of our cities and society. If we take this opportunity, we may be able to make our cities more equitable and more affordable, and actually bring back middle-class people and artistic and other creatives, and make cities a better place for less advantaged communities as well. So I think we'll be okay in the long run.
I'm glad to hear some optimism to kick off the show. Rebecca, I want to turn to you now. And cities have taken some extreme steps to respond to COVID. Can you remind us of some of those and talk about how sustainable they are, given we don't actually know how long this crisis is going to last?
Sure. Thanks, Susie. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Richard is saying about the future of cities. First off, I should say that I'm an ardent believer in the future of cities and in urbanism, and in the notion that it's up to us to define what we want the new normal to be as cities rebuild more resiliency with equity at the forefront. I mean, what I'm seeing in New York City up and down the East Coast with Karp Strategies clients being leading government agencies, developers, offshore wind companies, is really a prioritization of public health and really leading with public health and thinking about, what are the measures that those organizations need to take as we consider returning to work. So we're seeing on the commercial real estate side and landlords really taking measures toward prioritizing safety of workers. So everything from temperature checks to thinking about air circulation within buildings to thinking about how do you space workers out so you have that approximate physical distance. We're seeing extraordinary efforts from organizations like the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the MTA in New York City, where for the first time ever, the MTA has shut down overnight to be doing really extraordinary cleaning efforts to ensure the safety of commuters so they can get to work. And we're seeing really extraordinary response by agencies and organizations, retailers, et cetera, to think about how do they reposition so that workers can come back safely. And for those who aren't, I think we have an obligation across the board, if you are not an essential worker, to do everything you can to support the safety of essential workers as they're continuing to work and returning to work.
So we see some response in the short term, the response to the crisis. I want to talk about now, Andre, with you, a more persistent, longer term problem. You've said no one invests in problems. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the thesis of your book and the opportunities that you've found in your research.
Yeah, I say all the time, nothing grows without investment. The problem with a lot of university and think tank research, we constantly harp on disparities for good reason. We want to show the differences between white, Black, Latino, Native Americans in terms of the various outcomes. The problem is that with this framing of constantly showing disparities is that Black folk are always framed as a deficit. And that framing often leads people to feel that Black people are a problem needing to catch up to white people without taking into consideration the structural racism that created those disparities. And the problem is no one invests in deficits. No one invests in problems. So a lot of what I do in my book, Know Your Price, is uplift the assets in Black majority cities that are undervalued and would rise in quickly with investment. You would see greater returns if we saw the investment. Nothing grows without investment. But what COVID revealed is how little we invest in Black people in cities. And so we need a strategy to invest in Black people, homeowners, potential homeowners, business owners in Black cities, in Black neighborhoods to really see cities take off equitably.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the numbers there? There are real hard numbers that investors are just missing. Talk to us about the price of homes, for instance.
Yeah, when the study that anchors my book, Know Your Price, is I looked at home prices in Black majority cities where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%, and compared those prices to places where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics you see. And what we found essentially astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's $156 billion, and what amounts to lost equity. And we know that people use equity in their homes to send their kids to colleges, to start businesses, to move to a better neighborhood. Municipalities use that money in terms of tax revenue to fund policing, education, infrastructure. So it's a big number. And that money that is essentially lost, essentially robbing Black people of the opportunity to lift themselves. And so any kind of long-term strategy moving forward, because we know another crisis will occur, we've got to restore the value that's been extracted by racism and then provide some type of stimulus to really excite the economy in those areas.
So we're hearing about the undervaluing of, in the case of your work, the Black community. I think community is a really important word to pick up on. Any change is only going to be successful if there's buy-in from the community. Johnny, I want to turn to you with that in mind. Can you tell us about your work in Ferguson? How did you connect the community with the public officials to let information flow both ways and really get to a place where change could happen? And do you think those same kind of tactics can still work right now?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, E-Little Communication Group, we worked for, the city of Ferguson for over 3 years. And, it was ironic that when our firm started, it was when the prosecuting attorney announced no charges against the police officer. So we really had to jump into, the crisis mode. And I think that this is a very pivotal time for cities across the nation to be able to really look at economic equity as far as businesses, as far as residents, and as far as stakeholders. The reason why this particular unfortunate incident of George Floyd has the entire world looking in the mirror to be able to say, hey, this is something that over the years, not only 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 400 years ago, there has been some type of disparity towards African Americans. One of the things that we did with, Ferguson was to be able to speak with the protesters and serve as the liaison between the protesters and the city officials. A lot of town hall meetings were held, but I think it's very important that there was a special yesterday, from Oprah Winfrey to say, well, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? You can have all of the town hall meetings, you can have all of the, focus groups, but it's important to say that you have to have some measurable standpoints to say, this is where we are going to change. This is where we're going to go into the neighborhoods. This is where we're going to take a look at the different, homeowners and see, how much the home is valued in this particular zip code from another zip code. So that's very important. And that's one of the things that we were able to do, as you see, and then I'll finish, but as you can see, just last week, the city of Ferguson elected their first African-American mayor, Ella Jones, which is, a step in the right direction. It takes, when you're speaking to the community, understanding the importance of voting, understanding the importance of getting out to vote. So those are the type of things that we did, and those are the type of things that are going to take place for this particular time to move the nation forward.
We are hearing a lot about actually taking action now and getting beyond the rhetoric. It's great to see that with your experience in Ferguson, that has now led to some actual change. I want to just welcome everyone who's coming and joining us right now from the stream. This is Business Unusual. It is a live show where we're talking about the changing nature of work. And today we are looking at cities post-pandemic. What are the opportunities to rebuild in a more thoughtful way with this wonderful panel of experts? I want to say hello to some of the guests joining us. We have Ruby from Dallas. Corey is from DC, Marta from Maryland, welcome to the show, Randy from Oklahoma, and LaShonda from San Francisco. Thank you so much for being here with us. Talking some more specifics, we're talking about race a bit here as well. Richard, talk to me about public health crises in the past. They've led to a lot of the things that we think of when we think of cities, of different building regulations and city parks. Yesterday, Indianapolis just passed a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. What kind of opportunities is this reframing actually set up?
Well, it is. And poverty and racism are probably two of the driving forces behind the incredibly uneven and disparate health impacts of this. So we have to solve them. Look, it's interesting. We are focused in the near term on the lockdown. I'm still living in a lockdown in Toronto, Ontario. It hasn't been lifted. That stuff gets forgotten. As a nearly 40-year career in urbanism, I never really heard about the lockdowns until very recently that occurred in 1918 in the wake of the Spanish flu. What we tend to be the lasting impact are these impacts on the physical structure and the built environment and the public health of cities. The fact that we have better parks in cities has a lot to do with making our cities freer from infectious disease and pestilence. The fact that we have water fountains and running water and sanitation, building codes that allowed for ventilation and fresh air and sunlight, all of those are a legacy of our cities grappling with infectious diseases like the Spanish flu or cholera or tuberculosis. I think the lasting impacts of this crisis will be two. One, I think our cities will have to, as Rebecca said, deal with public health and safety. This will just have to become part of the way we think about our cities. Everything from our subways and our transit to our buildings to our streets. And we'll see, for example, more bike lanes and better walkability as a result, more street cafes. The other big impact we'll be beginning to deal with and have a conversation about these factors which have contributed to inequity, disparity, and public health crises, like race and class and the health vulnerabilities, those will be the lasting impacts of this crisis for sure.
With that, Rebecca, I want to go to you. We're hearing from Richard about inequities. I think there's been a lot of talk about inequities around public transportation. There's a lot of fear that this is a virus that passes in highly dense areas, but at least in New York, we're seeing some of the worst cases in places where lower income people work, and they have to take the subway. They still have to come all the way wherever they are working their frontline jobs. People are not feeling confident about public transportation right now, but it's necessary to fully reopen an economy. The CDC is recommending people drive solo in cars. Richard's talking about cities like Paris and Milan looking more to making safer bicycle situations. What does this mean for this moment of equity and sustainability?
I mean, there's so many implications for it, right? And I mean, I see everyone on the panel nodding. I think we all want to get in on this part of the conversation. I think specific to your question, I think there are a few things. One, I think there are actions that every employer needs to take if they can, which is to allow employees at any organization, whether you're an essential worker or not, to be able to shift your schedules so that employees are commuting. In big cities, you're often relying on mass transit, whether that be buses or trams or subways or light rail, so that we can spread rush hour, so that we can not be in packed cars as much as possible. So that's something that employers can do. We already know that many transit agencies are doubling down on their cleaning efforts. That's fantastic. I think there are a lot of things that cities can be doing, to your question on sustainability, to be using this time for planning, and to points that many of the panelists have raised, to be planning for equity. I think to Andre and Johnny's point, I mean, a lot of this comes back to how money is spent and how money is spent equitably. If we really want to be thinking about sustainability, resilience, equity for our future, it comes back to how money is spent, how budgets flow from cities, and I would argue the private sector. This is a time that I think we can be thinking about MWBE procurement and contracting. This is time that we can be thinking about how are we reshaping our public realm? How are we thinking about planning for the future? Who's involved in those conversations? We're seeing so much mass participation in public conversations right now. How do we channel this from the talk and public action we're seeing now into conversations about budgeting toward implementation and action that will result in the kind of change that I think so many people want to see? So that's where I'm really excited to see things moving.
That's great.
Can I just add on pile on a little bit of this? It's been clear that structural inequality has been exposed by not only the killing of George Floyd, but COVID. And I do agree that racism is a public health crisis. And I also agree that our city budgets don't reflect that. Part of the greatness of this defund police movement, it is forcing us to look at our budgets and say, oh, do we really want to prevent the next epidemic, the next pandemic, the next uprising? If we do, then we have got to shift monies from police forces, and nothing screams of ineffectiveness, bloat, and just a lack of quality than seeing a tank among your police force. And so we've got to remove those drags in various markets in the economy and police forces, municipal government, that are preventing us from getting to long-term solutions. Cities aren't going anywhere. But if we don't shore up the people who are vulnerable to these episodic issues or these shocks to the economy, we'll be right back in the same position when the next inevitable disaster strikes.
And if I can really quickly, Richard brought up a really good point. If you look at what's taken place in the minority communities with COVID-19, the minority communities are the ones that have been affected the most. And if you drive down any area, you will see the most fast food restaurants. You will see, the corner stores instead of the major chain as far as supermarkets, where you can get fresh vegetables, where you can get all of those different type of things. So when it comes to budgeting and when it comes to investing into the communities, those are the type of conversations that need to be held for, the larger chain supermarkets to say, where can we invest in the community? And this is how you begin to change, how people eat, how people think. So whether it's in St. Louis, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in New York, when you change the zip code, it's still the same situation. But this, from COVID-19, from this unfortunate situation with George Floyd, this is now opening up the minds of the decision makers to say, how can we change this? But it has to start right now, and it can't just be something that happens right now, and then we forget about it in 2 weeks or a month.
Yeah, I'm seeing this from the stream too, the thoughts about distributing resources in different ways. Caroline has a question. She says, Andre, you mentioned switching up budgeting. What public systems do you think need more capital to better prepare for the next disaster?
Well, I'm clear. I'm a firm believer in education and housing. I think any capital you can move towards the development of people and education gets to the core of that, but also housing, because housing is so central to every other policy. When you're thinking about how you pay for education and policing, it's really homes and home prices and the tax revenue we generate from that really have an influence in what we can do. And so I think, at some point we're going to have a serious conversation with the federal government on how to shore up housing in America. Clearly, we have an affordability a problem in some cities, and in others, we simply have a problem of getting low-income renters into homes as homeowners. And so we need to find creative ways to improve the housing options in cities, and that will also help drive to improve resources toward schools in the long run.
Thank you, Andre. I'm hearing from Oscar in the stream agreeing that we're talking about cities as a whole, but he says that he thinks there are huge differences within cities. Definitely true. Richard, I want to turn to you for this one. We're talking about making change here. Cities are different. Where's the most effective place, in your opinion, to make that change? Is it at the federal level? Do you start state? Do you start local?
Well, we're not going to have much change at the federal level for at least 7 or 8 months, and hopefully then we will. So we have no other choice but to start at the local level, and that's where we're starting. We have seen mayors, we have seen city managers, we have seen neighborhood and community organizations and residents rise up. Look, building on what Andre said, housing has to become a basic human right. It has to become something that every single American is guaranteed the right to adequate shelter and the access to a good job that pays you well and allows you to use your full talents and capabilities. Those just have to be basic rights that we have in this country, and we'll get there. But the innovation in this country is going to come from our cities. And as the questioner said, so not all of our cities are alike. New York and Toronto and London and Los Angeles and San Francisco, these big superstar cities, which are horribly unaffordable, are very different than St. Louis or Detroit or Cleveland, which are, again, very different than Houston and Atlanta. So in many ways, while we have to make housing and a good job and better wages and safe living conditions and a movement from policing to strengthening the social fabric, universal things, we have to tackle those in different ways in different kinds of cities, for sure.
Johnny, I want to turn to you off that question. You have experience in Ferguson actually making these tactical changes at the ground level, working with leaders, working with the community. What are a few small things that people can keep in mind to generally make connections back to their communities and try to make these changes?
I have seen organizations in Ferguson. There were meetings that were being held at their community center. I think with something like this, you have to, it's kind of like the comment that Richard said, stating that we will get there. We have to dive deeper into that. We will get there and start the conversation with, like Ferguson did. They held meetings in their community center, and then they had to be able to have all of the participants to write down their name, their location, and to be able to communicate with them, to have smaller meetings. It's more organic, it's more grassroots, and then you're able to spread it out. You have to have organizations who are able to fund it, to be able to say, we can sponsor a meeting we will make sure that there are ways, because funding is very important. You have the cities who do not have larger budgets, and then you have the federal government, but there are corporations who can say, we will be able to sponsor 10 meetings over a 90-day time frame, and then to be able to create a report and then contact those individuals who participated. So it's more for something like this to happen, as it did in Ferguson, as it did across the country, in Minneapolis, whether it's in Georgia, you have to go grassroots.
All right, so there's some advice about going grassroots. Rebecca, I want to ask you for a moment. I know that you're connecting with leaders all over the world about the global experience of going through COVID. What are you learning from the response in other places that we might be able to take into consideration too?
Oh, I really appreciate that question, Susie. I think one of the most interesting things that I've been hearing from urban planners and folks working in real estate development around the world is this notion, kind of really just picking up on what Johnny was saying too, about like cross-sector collaboration, and this idea that if this was something that government led before, it might not be the case right now. It might be the situation that like a local nonprofit leader or your neighbor might be the one picking up the mantle and saying, this is what we need to do, I'm just going to get it done. Or the idea that if a private company was leading something before, now government is doing it. And this idea that this is the time to put aside, processes from the past and to work together to identify like, what do we need to do, given that we're still in the middle of like this massive pandemic and economic recession, to identify challenges and come up with solutions that support particularly members of our most vulnerable communities and those who are most hard hit from the pandemic. We're thinking about how do we rebuild together, coming out of the pandemic and recession. So the ideas that I've heard from folks who've reached out primarily via LinkedIn from cities around the world are this idea of really reaching out, asking very direct targeted questions and cross-sector collaboration in the truest sense, and people being very open and receptive to that, and really saying, okay, money is not on the table. This isn't a procurement conversation. This is a conversation about, we're seeing this crisis in this neighborhood. How do we get PPE here? We're seeing a transit challenge here. How do we solve that? And how do we communicate and work together to solve the problem, regardless of what formal institution we're part of, regardless of what our title is? That's very exciting. And I think lessons we can be bringing back to cities in the US.
That's great. Hearing about cross-sector collaboration that's working globally, that you're in those conversations right now. Andre, I want to think about the cross-sector collaboration bit in relation to achieving equity. What are some of the concrete things that cities should be doing to back up the rhetoric about wanting to use this moment to be more equitable and grow back in better ways?
There were when Amazon was searching for their headquarters, there was a lot of ideas thrown out on how to incentivize companies, and in many cases we sold the farm to get the Amazon into town. But I do think there's a role that tax incentives can play to hire people who have been displaced by our social distancing efforts. It's clear that we're going to be in a recession for a long period of time, and it's incumbent upon those companies that we've essentially helped bail out, provided resources to stay afloat, that they help ease the job losses and folks who've lost their businesses, which will certainly impact the Black and Brown communities. It's incumbent upon those companies to help create jobs and on-ramps to quality jobs. In addition, we have got to figure out ways to make essential workers matter in terms of pay and benefits. And that's something that municipalities can do a better job companies can do a better job at doing. But I think it's clear we need investments in people, and companies and cities have a lot they can do together in order to increase those investments.
Thank you for that, Andre. We have Michelle in the stream saying that these topics are very important and we must find solutions. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today to talk about some potential solutions at a high level and even right down to the local level, what you can do when you get people in that community center together. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. There's so much more we could talk about.
Yeah.
Our time here is ended for today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for joining on the stream. We saw a lot of great comments and questions. It's always great to see the community turn out to talk about these big issues. We are Business Unusual. We are live from the LinkedIn news page 5 days a week at noon Eastern. Tomorrow, please come back at noon Eastern to join my colleague Caroline Fairchild as she talks with the EVP of CVS Health and the president of Aetna about prioritizing mental health amidst this challenging time that we are in right now. Thank you so much. I'm Susie Jackson. It's been great having you with us. Stay safe.